Your objective for lesson 22 is I will recognize and show that equivalent fractions refer to the same point on the number line. So we're going to continue working with equivalent fractions, fractions that are equal to one another, but this time we're going to be using number lines to see if fractions are equivalent to one another. Okay, so whenever you're looking at the fraction strips on the screen, you see that the top one is 2/4 and that the bottom one is 4/8. The fractional units are different because you see that the fraction 2/4 and 4/8 don't have the same numbers, but are 2/4 and 4/8 equivalent or equal to one another? So on your piece of paper in your binder, I want you to answer that question of whether 2/4 and 4/8 are equivalent to one another. And I also want you to put why are they equivalent to one another based on the fraction strips that you see on the screen. So I want you to push pause and write that answer on your paper in your binder, and whenever you're ready to check your answer, I'd like for you to push play. Okay, so 2/4 and 4/8 are equivalent to each other, and the reason why is because, as you can see on the fraction strips, they have the same amount of shaded space. So besides the fraction strips that you see on the screen, another way that we can test to see if these fractions are equivalent or equal to one another is by using fraction number lines. So on your paper, I want you to put exactly what you see on the screen here, and make sure you leave some space between your number lines so we can fill in the fractions on the number lines. So whenever you get what's on the screen on your paper, you can push play. So for our first number line, we need to divide it into 4 equal parts. So if you can remember back whenever we made fraction number lines, it's been a few lessons back, we always started with a rectangle, and we divided our rectangle into how many parts that we needed to have on our number line. And then we made that many parts on our number lines based on the lines that we drew in our rectangle. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. And we're going to make our number line at the top have 4 equal parts, and we're going to make our number line at the bottom have 8 equal parts. And make sure that your parts are equal. So I'm going to have to take my lines and just drag them over a little bit to make them more equal. And once I have my lines, I'm now just going to take away my rectangle. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the number line at the bottom. But if you notice, I'm just going directly in the middle here, and I'm going to make a line, and then I'm going to go right here where this line is on the fours. I'm going to come directly down from that and make another line. Because really what I could do is go ahead and make this number line have 4 equal parts. And then in order for it to have 8 equal parts, I would just have to make one line in the middle of each of these other lines. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Make one line in the middle. And if you do that on your paper as well, it makes it a lot easier, and it makes your parts a lot more equal. And then once you have that done, we're going to take away the rectangle, and now our number lines have the parts that they need to have. Okay, we do need to label 0 and 1 on our number lines, because this is one whole that we're looking at, and we start at 0 and we end at 1. And really, this 0 right here is equal to 0/4, since this number line is divided into 4 equal parts. And this 0 is actually equal to 0/8. So what we're going to do now is we're only going to make 2/4 and 4/8 on the number line, because we just want to see if they're equal to one another. We don't have to label any other fractions because we're just looking at 2/4 and 4/8. So I know that if this is 0/4, when I come here, this would be 1/4, and then this next one would be 2/4. So I want you to label that on your number line as 2/4. Then when we're coming down here to the fraction number line that's divided into eighths, I know that 0 is really the same thing as 0/8. So this next one would be 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, and then 4/8. So I'm going to put that right underneath it. And the way that we tell if fractions are equivalent on number lines is if they're at the same place on the number line, the same point. So whenever you're looking directly above or below these fractions, you can see that they're at the same spot on their number lines. So that tells me that those two fractions are equivalent to one another. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and start working on the problem set, because the problem set is just like this, looking at number lines and finding whether or not the fractions are equivalent, or you finding equivalent fractions on the number line whenever the fractions aren't given to you. So if you want to go ahead and get out your problem set and make sure you have that ready, and then push play whenever you're ready to move on. Okay, so for number 1, it says label the 2 number lines below with fractions. So usually what we've done is we've made our number lines based on fractions that we already know that we're going to put on there. So there's not really a lot of times where we've worked on number lines where we have to go ahead and label them based on what they have already put. So we're going to use the strategy that we always do, and we're going to put our rectangle from 0 to 1. And I'm going to do that on both of my number lines, and then once you have put your rectangles from 0 to 1, you can see how many equal parts there are on the number lines. So up here on the top number line, there's 1, 2, 3 equal parts. So that tells me that I'm going to start labeling my fractions, and they're going to have a denominator of 3. I'm not going to label the 0, so I'm going to go over here, and this first box is going to be 1/3. The second box is going to be 2/3, and then 1, I know that there's not a box for it, but I do want you to go ahead and label it as 3/3. So make sure you're labeling this. If you need to push pause, you can go ahead and do that now. Okay, and let's look at the bottom number line. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 equal parts. So that tells me that these fractions are going to have a denominator of 6. We're not going to label 0, 6, so we are going to go over here in the first box, and I want you putting 1, 6, and then you can put 2, 6, and then we're going to keep moving on to 3, 6, and then 4, 6, and then 5, 6, and once again, I do want you labeling 1 right next to it as 6, 6. And now what you can go ahead and do is just erase your, oh goodness gracious, I want you to erase your, oh my goodness. Okay, let's try that again. Erase your rectangles, like I'm trying to do, okay? And now we are going to work on this next question 2 and 3, where it says use the number lines above to identify 2 sets of equivalent fractions. So 2 sets of equivalent fractions is what we're going to be looking for. And once again, whenever you're working with number lines, you just you can look at the top number line or the bottom number line. It doesn't matter. But you're wanting to find 2 fractions that are at the same point on the number line. We can see that 0 and 0 are at the same point, but we're not really going to work with the zeros. So if I move over here to 1/3 and I go directly below 1/3, I can see that 2, 6 is at the same part in the same place on the number line. So right here on number 2, we're going to write 1/3 is equal to 2, 6. And if you remember what I taught you in the last lesson, to cross multiply. So I'm actually going to bring it down here again and write 1/3 is equal to 2, 6. I want you doing this on your paper as well. And then I'm going to cross multiply these, 6 and 1 and 2 and 3. And I know that 6 times 1 is 6, so I'm going to put that right there. And I know that 3 times 2 is 6, and I'm going to put that right there. So since both of these are equal to 6, that tells me and it reassures me that yes, 1/3 and 2, 6 are equivalent fractions. Okay, now we're going to move on to number 3. I'm going to go on to the next fraction on the thirds number line, and I'm going to see that this is 2/3, and if I go directly below it, I see 4, 6. So now for number 3, we're going to put that 2/3 is equal to 4, 6, and the reason that these are equal to one another, or they are equivalent, is because they're at the same place on their number lines. And once again, let's double check our answer by bringing 2/3 down here, and it's equal to 4, 6. And then we're going to cross multiply, and we're going to double check that they're equal to the same thing. So whenever I multiply 6 times 2, I get 12. And when I multiply 3 and 4, I also get 12. So that reassures me once again that those 2 fractions of 2/3 and 4, 6 are equivalent to one another. Now if it said that, hey, we need to find another fraction on these 2 number lines that are equivalent to one another, if I'm going to keep going down here to 1, which is really equal to 3/3, all I would have to do is go right below it and see, hey, there's another 1. I know that 1 and 1 are the same thing, but the fractions 3/3 and 6/6 are also the same fraction, and they're at the same point on the number line. So that would be another fraction or another pair of fractions that would be equivalent to one another as well. Okay, we're going to move on to number 4, and we're going to do exactly what we just did on the first two number lines. So we need to get our rectangles and draw them from 0 to 1 on both of these number lines, so we can see how many equal parts there are on each number line. So on this first number line, the top one, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 equal parts. So that tells me that this number line is going to have fractions that have a denominator of 8. And then down here on the bottom number line, this has 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts. So these fractions are going to have a denominator of 4. So on these two number lines, I'm going to let you go ahead and fill in the fractions that go in these boxes yourself, and make sure you are also putting fractions for what the 1 stands for as well. Whenever you're ready to check those number lines, you can push play. Okay, so your number lines are going to look like this. And the directions say use the number lines above to identify two sets of equivalent fractions. So it's just like what we did on number 2 and 3. We're going to use the number lines and we're going to find two sets of equivalent fractions. And so what you can do is you can start at the number line with that's divided into 8s. And we're not going to use 0 once again. So when I look at 1/8 and I go down below here, I can see that there's not a fraction here. So there's nothing on this number line that's equivalent to 1/8. So when I scoot over here to 2/8 and I go directly below that, I see the fraction 1/4. So on your paper, you can put that 2/8 is equal to 1/4. The reason that they are equal to one another or equivalent to one another is because they're at the same place on the number line. So what I'm going to let you do to fill in the next two blanks on your paper is continue looking at the number line and find another set of fractions that are equivalent to one another and get those written down on your paper. And whenever you're ready to check your answer, you may push play. Okay, so I wrote all of the fractions that you could have put that are equivalent to one another. 4/8 is equal to 2/4, 6/8 is equal to 3/4, and 8/8 is equal to 4/4. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the back side of the problem set where we're doing the exact same thing. So up here on number 7, we need to get our rectangles drawn so we can see how many equal parts are on these number lines so we can start writing our fractions. So whenever I'm looking at this top number line, I see that there are 2 equal parts, so our fractions are going to have a denominator of 2. And on these number lines, I see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts, so these fractions are going to have a denominator of 4. So once again, for these two number lines, I want you to go ahead and fill in the fractions for these boxes, and then we're going to push play whenever we need to find the equivalent fractions. Okay, so your number lines are going to look like this. And all it says is use the number lines above to identify one pair of equivalent fractions. So on the line for number 8, I want you looking on your number lines and figuring out what pair of fractions could be equivalent. And I want you to write those on number 8. Okay, so I wrote down the fractions that you could have put. 1/2 is equal to 2/4, and also 2/2 is equal to 4/4. Okay, number 9 says draw and label two number lines below. Circle the fractions that are equivalent. So on your paper, you need to draw 2 lines, and you want to leave some space so that way you have room to write your fractions. Make sure you're putting your arrows at the end of your lines, and you're going to have to be thinking about what do you want to divide your number line into. If there's already some fractions that you know that are equivalent that we could use, I want you to think about that. We're not going to want to use the same exact fractions that we already used on the this paper so far. So we need to be thinking of what do we want to divide our number lines into so we can find two equivalent fractions. So for one, whenever I'm looking up here we've used halves and fourths. And on the front, we used thirds and sixths, and we used eighths and fourths. So we have not done thirds and halves, so we could do that on our number line. So let's go down here and let's divide our number line into halves and into thirds. So we're going to draw a line for 0, and we're going to draw a line for 1 on both of our number lines. And we're going to label those as 0 and 1. And then we're going to divide our first number line into halves, and we're going to divide our second number line into thirds, and we're going to see if any fractions on those number lines are equivalent to one another. Okay, so whenever I'm making this number line, and I need to divide it into 3 equal parts, let me erase those. I'm going to draw my rectangle before I forget so I know that my parts are equal. I'm going to draw my rectangle, and I'm going to make 3 equal parts. And we're going to see if any fractions for halves and thirds are equivalent to one another. So if you need to push pause to get your number lines just like they look on my screen, you can go ahead and do that. So now we're going to start labeling. If I know that 0 is 0 halves, I know that this first line right here is 1 half. And I know that this 1 is actually the same thing as 2 halves. And then down here on the bottom, if this is really 0 thirds, then we're going to label this first one 1 third. And then we're going to go to 2 thirds. And then we're going to go to 3 thirds. So whenever we're starting here at 1 half, we go down below it, you see that there's nothing on the thirds number line that is equal to 1 half. So the only other fraction that we have is 1 whole, which is the same as 2 halves. And then when you go directly below it, you see 1 whole again. And then that is the same thing as 3 thirds. So this tells me, and I'm just going to draw a circle around it. I would like for you to do the same thing on yours, that 2 halves and 3 thirds are equivalent to one another. Okay, so number 2 says, how do you know the fractions in your number line are equivalent? So we're going to answer it by saying, I know that the fractions are equivalent because they are at the same place on the number line. This also says, give an example to help explain your reasoning. So what that means, or what I'm thinking it means is, let's give an example of maybe another fraction that's not equivalent because they're not at the same place on the number line. So we can say, let's use 1 half. And we can say 1 half does not or doesn't have an equivalent fraction on the number line because there isn't a fraction that is at the same place on the number line as 1 half. So that's what it's meaning as give an example to help explain your reasoning. Because we know that 2 halves and 3 thirds are equivalent because they're at the same place, but there isn't anything that's equivalent to 1 half because it doesn't have another fraction right below it that's at the same place on the number line. So now we're going to move on to the exit slip. Your exit slip looks like this. But I do want you to notice that they're already giving you the fractions 1 half, 2 fourths, 3 fourths, 5 eighths, 1 third, 2 fifths, 2 thirds, and 4 sixths. So on your number lines, you don't necessarily have to fill in every single fraction. What you really need to do is just label 1 half and 2 fourths, 3 fourths, 5 eighths, 1 third, 2 fifths, and 2 thirds, and 4 sixths. And then on the lines, it's asking if they are equivalent or not equivalent. So on your lines, you're going to put that they are equivalent, or you're going to put that they are not equivalent based on what you're seeing on the number line. So whenever you have this paper done, you may bring it to me so we can go over it.